You shape your book around a road trip to or through the Florida Keys. And as we often see with memoirs, sort of the scene shifts from the present to the past, and it kind of goes that way. Um, just as you were thinking about writing this memoir and how you would set it up, um, what was it about that trip that made you decide to use that trip to organize your memoir around it?
I thought the trip was symbolic in a way, in that going from the coastline of Florida all the way to the to Key West, which is the southernmost point in the for the U.S., represented a really long journey, just like the one that my father and his wartime commander took in order to get to America and restart their lives. And so I thought that was a nice relevance with their story versus the road trip, which they shared their accounts of what they went through. And so the road trip kind of brackets that whole experience of retelling their story.
And so during that road trip, I mean, was that an opportunity for you to ask them more information about what they had experienced?
Well, that's how I got the idea for the book, was learning about their journey on that road trip. Because before then, I loved sitting and talking to my dad about, his past and what he went through in the war. But it was bits and pieces of it from his perspective over the years. But on this road trip, I really got a full picture coming from him. He spoke more, and because he had his wartime commander there, and they were able to share their stories. And so I got different people's perspective. My father, General Yi, and also my mom and the other relatives of my dad's generation that experienced it. So I got a lot of perspective, and a lot of stories were shared all at one time. So when it hit me, I thought, wow, this is really amazing. To be spending 3 days in a car hearing all these stories, I felt after the road trip that I had to share it. And so that road trip really was the inspiration for.
You said that you heard snippets of your dad's story, but it was this road trip where you sort of stuck together in a car, and you can hear people talk, and you have these kinds of conversations. I suppose that's normal. I've heard from a lot of people who listen to interviews I do with war veterans, wives even, who I've been married to this guy for 50 years, and I hadn't heard all of these things that I heard in this discussion. It reminds me of the importance of sharing these stories. And you write early on in the memoir, you're talking about your dad, and you say his coworkers did not know that he had grown up in wartime, fought in a war where he had to identify the bodies of dead childhood friends, carry dying soldiers off battlefields. They didn't know that he spent time in a communist re-education camp. You write these things. I mean, one of the things it reminds me of, that I'm reminded of constantly as I have these conversations, is that people carry stories around that they don't talk about. But one of the things, so I'm getting around to my question, and I don't know if you'll have an answer to it or not, but one of the things that I thought about when I read that passage and then just listening to you now is war veterans often are reluctant to share their memories of the war or of war. I've noticed when it comes to Vietnam veterans that South Vietnamese veterans, that veterans who fought with the South Vietnamese Army are, in my experience, well, I mean, actually, aside from when I've been in South Vietnam or old South Vietnam, when I've been in Vietnam, I have talked to South Vietnamese veterans there. But here in the States, I haven't yet been able to convince a single South Vietnamese veteran to share his memories. Do you have any thoughts about why that might be, why veterans of the South Vietnamese Army might be even more reluctant to share their memories than other veterans?
That's an interesting question. And I thought about that with my dad. And so I can't speak for how the other South Vietnamese Army soldiers or service members may feel, but I think maybe of the reluctance could be just an acceptance of what happened. You know, South Vietnam lost, you know, they lost a war, they lost their country, they lost their homeland, their identity. So for them, they probably held on to a lot of trauma, which I think, you know, you see in American veterans as PTSD when they come back, but for the Arvins, you don't hear that, and they hold that a lot of it in. And so for them, after the war ended, they didn't have time to heal. They had to survive, either from the concentration camps that they were sent to escaping the country as refugee, and then starting their lives over as immigrants. And maybe in a way that might be a good thing, not for them to dwell on these past tragedies, but to start over again. And maybe that's something that they just push behind them in order to start a new life. And the other thing is maybe they, for some of them, they just weren't given the opportunity to, because I don't think for a long time their voices were heard just in the mainstream. So I think a number of factors. I think maybe just wanting to put the past behind them and just kind of an acceptance of what happened and moving on, and or maybe for some people not having the opportunity, and maybe English could be a huge thing. English language, as a lot of them may not feel comfortable in sharing truly how they felt or their experience because of the lack of being able to express it clearly in English, and that maybe that's the reluctance too.
Sure.
So I think, you know, for a lot of South Vietnamese service members, I think there's still a lot of for them, they still feel a lot deeply, but it's just having the avenue to express it. And for them, you know, maybe that's the way they cope with it, of having to be on the losing side.
Yeah. You use the phrase, they lost their country, which of course, you know, literally is true. South Vietnam goes out of existence in April 1975. What is your own relationship with Vietnam in your own mind? Have you been to Vietnam?
Yes, a few times with my parents.
With your parents. So, and where did you go, to Saigon or Da Nang, or where?
The first time that I went back, since I left when I was a child, I left Vietnam when I was 5. So Vietnam will always be, to me, my birthland. And I try to retain the culture maybe in terms of how I feel about it. But like I said, I left when I was 5. And when I go back there, I'm almost viewed as a foreigner to a lot of the Vietnamese over there, based on the way I speak Vietnamese, the way I dress, or the way I look. So they can spot, you know, they can spot someone who's an expatriate. When I go back, I see the saddest thing that I see are really hardworking people, very intelligent, industrious, but they don't have opportunity. That's why you see so many street vendors. You see kids on the street selling postcards and tissue papers to tourists when they should be in school. And you see able-bodied men and women working at food stalls, selling sodas and things like that, where they should be able to learn a trade or be in school. Or I could easily see a lot of them in office works or doing computer work, anything, you know, but instead I see them, you know, not having opportunities when I go back to Vietnam. And that's the saddest thing to see, is that in a very communist country still, they retain that model, and where they don't give a lot of opportunities to their people.
Yeah.
I hope that.
No, that's right. The issue isn't that they're not working hard. They're working very, very hard, but the opportunities aren't there. And of course, that reminds me of a central theme of your book. You describe you discussed your dad's war experience, and then after the war, he spends, is it 3 years in a re-education camp? 3 years, and then refugees escaping Vietnam, going to Thailand, eventually making your way to the States, various jobs. You mentioned working in a poultry plant, which I know can be very difficult work. Then, the restaurant in Houston, and I think, is it Houston, in a tough area in Houston, and making a go of it. And seeing people working very, very, very hard. But there's the underlying sense there is that, this can actually lead to something for my kids. And so that's, one of the touching things about the memoir is, what comes through in the memoir is that your parents are working very, very hard, because they have a sense that, the kids can have a lot more than what we had growing up. Yeah. And you're a doctor now.
Yes, yes.
Well,
I was trained as a family physician. I went to medical school on a military scholarship, and trained with the military. And now I work with individuals with special needs.
wow. Yeah, so I want to talk about your military service. Do you ever, I'm sure it comes to your mind a lot, but do you ever sort of stop in your tracks and, maybe you hear somebody address you as doctor, and then remember that when you were a kid, you were in a refugee camp in Thailand?
I do. It doesn't hit me all the time, but I'm very aware of my journey, where I've been, all the hardships that my parents have gone through. And for me and my brother, when we came over here with my parents, so it's made everything that I've been able to achieve now very rewarding, and I don't take it for granted. And that's part of, I think the struggle makes what you have more rewarding and satisfying, is to be able to overcome that. And so, as you see, the title of the book is called Soldier On. And I chose that title to not to just describe my journey, but everything in this book, my father's journey, his wartime commander general Train by You's journey. And I hope it also does justice to the journey that many South Vietnamese who've had to flee Vietnam have also shared in this journey of persevering through whatever adversity that they've had to encounter in life.
Yeah, yeah. I want to come back and talk about that journey. Let me, before that, you said that Vietnam is a country where there's a capitalist vibe, for lack of a better way of putting it. I'm thinking again especially of Da Nang and Nha Trang, but as you say, there's a lot of corruption. In your book, you mention a couple times, for example, I think twice, you mentioned corruption in old South Vietnam and how General Yi would not participate in it. He could have had he wanted to, but he did not. When you think about your dad's case, perhaps General Yi's case, what were they fighting for? I mean, because when we look back at the Vietnam War, one of the challenges is that it appears that the governments of South Vietnam did not inspire a lot of confidence, right? So if we could pull your dad aside in 1970 and say, what are you fighting for? Are you fighting for the government? What's the motivation to be in this fight? What would he have said?
Knowing my dad, being probably the 20-something soldier that he was, he would give you the same answer as a lot of service members over here if you ask them what they were fighting for. He was fighting to for his soldiers, the men to his right and his left, to keep them safe, to keep himself safe, and to kind of, I mean, I think this was a 20-year war. So that my parents and the people of his generation grew up. They've had all their milestones amidst the backdrop of war. That's all they knew. And when I think about that now, and I've asked my parents, how did you manage to go through, your teenage years and your milestones as a young adult when you had, war right at your doorstep? And for some people, war is a concept, especially we're so lucky in America, war is a concept that happens in other countries where, we go and we send troops to, but not right at your doorstep. In this current time, not in the Civil War or anything like that, but in more modern times, they've had, they didn't have that. But the people, my parents' generation, Vietnam, had to deal with all of that. And so it was a reality for them, and they just had to find a way to cope with it while they were just surviving and living. And so I think he would give the same answer as any service member. It was for to protect the lives of his buddies and protect his own life and try to get through it.
I'm glad you say that. And having served in the Army, you know that, because that's true. You don't hear, if you interview a combatant or somebody in a war zone, why are you fighting? They're not going to give you some philosophical answer. It's, I'm fighting for me and the person next to me, and so, so that makes sense. Something you just said reminds me of a passage here. Here's what you write about your mom. Marriage, war, the births of children, the death of her beloved mother, followed by Dad's imprisonment, within quick succession, changed life for Mom. All this happened before she had turned 25. The days of protection and pampering from her parents were long gone. She raised her children alone, not knowing the fate of her husband. So she has a husband who's in war, and you described, actually in combat, and then he's a prisoner for 3 years in a re-education camp. And all of this happens before, she's 25. What sort of lifelong toll or lifelong mark would you say that left on your mom? Just having these, just sort of wave after wave of really difficult experiences. And then as we move through the memoir, now we're on a boat that's going to Thailand. Now we have Thai pirates who are, causing problems for us. Now we're in a new country where we don't speak the language. We're moving from place to place. We're living in one, pretty difficult living circumstance after another. What sort of mark did all this make on your mom?
I think for any human being to experience all of that, that must have left a lot of scars, tremendous. And I don't know how she coped with it, or anyone in that situation could cope with something like that, other than they've had to have a lot of resiliency. And so, again, it just goes to the theme of everyone that I encountered in writing this book. They've had to face, using their challenges, putting it mildly, but some type of obstacle where they just had to carry on. It's just part of survival. You can choose to just crumble and just fall up and say, I can't go on. Or you can make the other decision and say that I have to dig deeper, for the sake of, at that time she had me and my brother, for my children, or having a hope of seeing her husband again, and maybe having the hope of just seeing a better day. But I don't know. You just have to have that survival instinct, and just continue.
You describe one instance in the memoir when a North Vietnamese or a guard in the re-education camp, if I remember correctly, hits your dad in the head with the butt of his rifle, if I remember that right. The question, how does that make you feel? It sounds like a stupid question, but when you image that, when you have a picture of that in your own mind, your dad in the camp, he's a combatant. South Vietnam has lost the war. Now these veterans go to re-education camps that happen throughout old South Vietnam. And then you have that particular incident where he's, brutalized in that way. What thoughts come to your own mind? What feelings do you have when you reflect on those sorts of things?
Well, of course, it makes me angry. I wish I could take that same rifle and just knock him back, right in the face. But
Yeah.
but it's an injustice. My dad endured, physical brutality from the treatment that he received in those jungle prison camps, just like so many others. And he was lucky to have survived that. Others that he told me that went through the prison camps with him weren't so fortunate, and they died. He saw them die, and a lot of times their families weren't even given the dignity of being informed of their death. And so, it's just a very horrific and sad situation. What was intended to punish South Vietnam, whether you're a civilian, like in the case with my mom after the war, as a wife to a military service member, and she was sent to hard labor, but at home, digging, tilling the soil, doing hard physical labor. And then my dad, his imprisonment, he served 3 years, while there were people who served, like General Yi served 17 years.
Yeah.
So all levels of severity, but a form of punishment.
Yeah. So you left Vietnam when you were 5, or probably the better verb is your family fled Vietnam when you were 5. So when I asked the question, what memories do you have of Vietnam as a child? I don't imagine that there are a lot. I asked myself that question, what do I remember as a 5-year-old? And the answer is, fragments of things. But what memories do you have of Vietnam as a young child?
I remember my first dog, which I wrote in the book. His name means marble in Vietnamese, because he was a mutt, but I don't know what breed he was. He just loved to roll around the floor, and so we thought that was a good name for him. Very smart dog. I remember the day where when we left Vietnam to make our escape, and we had to leave our home. And I remember him chasing us in the car that we were leaving from. He normally didn't, chase cars or anything, but he could sense something was different that day. And I don't know why, but when I wrote this book, that image of him chasing the car, like he was just frantically trying to keep up with it, it stuck with me. It's strange how some things that may seem not so significant become part of your core memory later on.
Would you say that that's the strongest memory you have of your early childhood in Vietnam, the dog Marble?
No, but that's a significant one. I have, like you said, bits and pieces of things. I remember, the place where my mom and I, my brother, lived while my dad was in prison. Little bits and pieces of it, and a little bit of the escape out of Vietnam.
Yeah. So I'll ask about Thailand in a second, but back to Marble, because that actually is the scene that most sticks in my mind. I mean, I there are a number of scenes in the book that are vivid in my mind right now, but that's the one that I'm not sure why. except that the sense I have that, human beings create messes for themselves, but the animals are innocent. I always kind of have that feeling. Um, but yeah, that image, there actually were a couple places in the memoir where I choked up a little bit. And that was one of them, as I kind of imagined this dog, chasing you, um, as you were fleeing Vietnam. So it might sound like kind of a dumb question, and I think we can assume at this point Marvel's not alive anymore. But suppose Marvel were, and then suppose somehow he could speak English. Um, what would you say to him?
I would say to him that I wish I could have taken him with us. Or I wish I could have stayed there with him. That was one of the things I did remember. When my mom said, we're not going to live here anymore, we're going to leave, but to keep it a secret, not to tell anyone, because we couldn't have anyone find out about our escape, or we would be captured. And I remember telling her at that time, no, I don't want to leave. I want to stay here. I want to stay home. I didn't know what America was. I'm like, I didn't want to go to America. I want to stay here with my dog. But I would say, I wish I could have taken him with us. He was the smartest and the best dog. He suffered along with us during that time. Remember, he didn't have enough food to eat, and a lot of times, and my mom would tell me this. I don't remember, but she said that sometimes we didn't have enough food to eat, let alone feed our dog, where he would have to go out in the field and chew on grass because he was so hungry.
Mm,
And when I think about that, that makes me sad.
yeah.
He was such an obedient dog, so smart. So, and my dad, when he felt like he couldn't provide for his family and even be able to feed the dog after he was released from the communist prison camps, he knew that this wasn't the life for our family. Because after he was released, he wasn't allowed to go back and live with us. He was sent to live in a town that was hours away, like a lot of released prisoners. And he was made to do farm labor, even though he never had any experience doing that. He had an education in Vietnam, but as a form of punishment, and your punishment wasn't over after you left prison camp. So he had to learn to till, farm and do that kind of work. And he had to get permission in order to visit us every time he wanted to go home. And he knew that my brother and I would not be able to have an education in Vietnam because children of former military government or any kind of dissident that spoke out against the communist government, their children, their family members were discriminated against. And we would not have a chance for any sort of decent life. So that was his decision to say, we can't stay here like this.
And so you get on a boat, I think designed for maybe 100 people, if I remember right, and you've got more than 300 on it, if I have that correct, and you make your way first to Thailand. When I read that, I was reminded of an experience I had in the late 80s when I was in the Navy. I was on an aircraft carrier, and then word came in that there was a boat that was sinking. And so we went into a rescue operation, and we ended up with a few dozen at least Vietnamese refugees on our boat and on our ship. And then we took them from there to the Philippines, and then I don't know what happened after that. Being a typical 21-year-old, I really didn't think much of it. But this was in the late 80s, and you're describing leaving Vietnam. Is it 1979? Is that right? When your family leaves Vietnam? Please.
End of 78, yeah, going into 79.
The end of 78. And then the ship I'm on, the USS Ranger, has this experience with refugees from Vietnam a decade later. And so we're talking about wave after wave after wave of people fleeing Vietnam. What memories do you have? Again, you're a very young child, but what memories do you have of that trip to Thailand? What memories do you have of the Thai refugee camp itself?
Well, I remember leaving Vietnam. So in order for us to leave as a family, because my dad was separated from us after he was released from the communist prison, my grandfather had to arrange paperwork, fake documents for us to travel as family, so we can go to the coastal town that where the fishing boat was waiting for refugees. And so I remember late, it was late at night. We were, again, these are just bits and pieces of memory, but we were crammed into a cargo truck. And then we snuck into an old fishing boat. It was disguised as a fishing boat. Because at that time, passages into these fishing boats weren't free. You had to pay in gold bars in order to get onto these fishing boats. And so, people, it was a dangerous journey, but at the same time, a lot of people couldn't even afford to make this type of perilous journey. And so a lot of times you hear, people leaving, sending their children, and then the parents staying behind, or sending their child with an aunt or an uncle while the family stayed behind. I think because of this reason, they just couldn't afford to make that journey. And so families were separated in the hopes of just the risk for a better life. Then my other memories, and my parents helped me fill in a lot of these memories that I described in the book. But I remember just feeling very sick on the boat because it was a 3-day journey from the coast of Vietnam over to the neighboring Thailand. There was no food, no water, because there was just no room for any of it. We were sitting like knee bent to chest, side by side. And people were just getting sick from dehydration. And I remember feeling very lightheaded. That was one of the memories I remember from probably lack of food and water, and just being out in the sea. So, those are some of my memories.
Yeah. You describe, now, do I remember right that four boats set out, but yours is the only one that made it to Thailand?
Right. 3 boats set out that night.
3 set out.
2 sank from the storm, but we just know that it sunk. And our boat made it, but it didn't make it without some harrowing events. I do remember that we were stuck out at sea at one point when the boat stopped moving. We were just drifting because the boat engine had died. I think water from had gotten into the boat engine and killed the boat battery. And somehow they were able to get the boat restarted again by finding some type of rope to yank the engine or the pulley back. But for some time, we thought that this could be it for us.
Wow.
Just a very weak, rickety fishing boat without an engine, just drifting out at sea. And then a storm was approaching to make matters worse. And it would have broken the boat apart. And we thought we were all going to die. But luckily, at the very last minute, they were able to get the engine started again, and we raced away from the storm. And then on the last night, we were just miles away from the Thai shore. We encountered Thai pirates. And so during this time, a lot of boats encountered Thai pirates that were trolling the seas, looking to rob, kill, abduct. And I think this was tracked by a lot of international organizations, and they knew that this was a problem, but I don't think they could have done anything about it. So our boat, we did encounter Thai pirate. And my dad said that the captain of the boat, he was familiar because he made a business he made a business into transporting people from Vietnam to Thailand. And so he was a little scared. He had some, I think, a grenade launcher, an M16, and he had a crew member that was Thai, who understood, Thai pirate culture, and they were able to negotiate with the Thai pirates. And in the book, I wrote about how, as a show of force, he had the women and children hide below deck, and he had all the men surround the boat as a show of force to say that, if you want to fight, we'll fight you, and you'll suffer from losses, and just like we will. But if you allow us to go to shore, I will give you the gold bars that I have. And so the Thai pirates agreed, and they escorted us to shore. And once we landed on the beach in Thailand, the Thai police were waiting. And so when the pirates saw that, they took off. The Thai police came and processed us, and they arrested the captain of the boat for smuggling illegally refugees into their country, because that still was not a legal thing. It was not accepted by the Thai government. But we weren't safe. Once we landed, unfortunately we were not treated well by the Thai police, because at this point I think the Thai government and also their police force were just sick of seeing these Vietnamese refugees washed up on their shores. And so that resulted in frustration and disrespect. And so they ended up, my mom said, robbing a lot of people, like demanding whatever precious items that they had, jewelry, to be taken off and handed over immediately that night. And they treated people not very kindly, like hitting them with the butts of their rifles if they were moving too slow. And so, unfortunately, we encountered that type of treatment, and then we were ushered into a warehouse where we were later processed into refugee camps in Thailand.
Wow. How long were you in Thailand altogether?
Almost close to a year.
Yeah. And we'll move forward. There's a short passage in the book where I guess some of your dad's brothers answered questions differently in Thailand, and so they ended up not coming to the States. So do I have that right? If I remember right, one goes to Australia, I think, and I forget where the other one goes. Right.
And so it wasn't my dad's brother. It was actually the people that we shared a hut with. Oh. They eventually became like brothers to my parents. When we landed in Thailand, when we were shipped into the refugee camp after we left the warehouse that the Thai police had us in, we were brought to a refugee camp. And there wasn't any, when we got there, there wasn't like there was shelter available. You had to build shelter from whatever you could find. And so that camp was established from the prior, the earlier waves of refugees that were brought there, that were now resettled into other Western countries. And so they left whatever crumbling shelters that they had left behind. And these are makeshift shelters built from tarps and whatever wood they could scavenge from the beach or on the hills there. But it was very, the sanitation was really poor for camp life, and there was really no maintenance or any type of things to keep it in order. And so my parents, their last piece of jewelry, which the Thai police didn't confiscate, my mom had hidden her wedding band, took my dad's wedding band and hid it inside her shoe when they got off the boat to hide from the Thai police that night, or else, if they had worn it, it would have been confiscated. But my mom took that last piece of jewelry, their wedding band, and exchanged it for building materials, where my parents could build a hut far away from like the center of camp, where it was very congested and living conditions were poor. So they found a place up on a hill that overlooked the campsite, but they still didn't have enough money to get all the supplies. And so these two sets of brothers agreed to chip in whatever money they had. So we would share a hut together. And so we became a family in the time that we shared that hut together. And the sets of brothers, like we were hoping to immigrate to the United States. But the United States gave first priority to people who either served in the military or government, somehow associated with it. And one of the ways that they would screen would be to ask these questions over again to make sure that the questions match and that what you said actually happened. I guess that was their vetting, crude vetting process.
Sure.
And one of the brothers didn't pay attention to the questions. The younger brother of the pairs of brothers that we lived with, he didn't pay attention to a very minor detail, and so his resettlement was delayed for I think a year or two when Australia finally picked them up. But
Australia, yeah, and there's the way you write about that reminds me of Marble. Our family waved until the brothers in the camp became tiny specks in the background. This theme of sort of things you're attached to, whether it's Marble or whether it's these brothers, just fading into the past as your family keeps, or fading into the distance, right? As your family keeps moving in a different direction. I want to just hear briefly about your military service and then about what you're doing now. Before I ask the question about military service, just one other question related to your family. One experience after another. I mean, any one of these experiences would go down in somebody's memory as a major life event. Having to trade your wedding ring for basic building materials. If that were the only thing in your story that a person experienced, that would be a major life event. But as we've discussed, I mean, your parents are just dealing with one thing after another. They do get to come to the States. You describe, interestingly, a number of people, at least early on, associated with churches. They seem to have a religious motivation to help. So there are people from different church backgrounds who reach out and help your family. Your family moves around, difficult living circumstances as your family's getting established. At any point along the way, do you remember either of your parents ever wondering whether they should have just stayed in Vietnam?
I'm sure that crossed their mind, but whether they made a habit of vocalizing it, I don't think they did, and it wouldn't have been helpful. But now that I'm older and I can sympathize with them more, I can imagine what a life-changing or change of fortune even for them. Because both of my parents, despite growing up amidst the backdrop of war, they had nice, comfortable lives in Vietnam. My dad came from an affluent family. He was the eldest. His father owned a brick factory. And so he lived more comfortably than most South Vietnamese. And my mom was the youngest child in the family. And by the time she was born, her brother and sister had already gotten married. And so she was treated like the only child, and my grandparents doted on her. So my parents had comfortable lives. And the reason I bring that up is because that all changed drastically. Once the war in Vietnam ended, and just like for all South Vietnamese, and they had a drastic change in fortune. My dad both of my parents came to this country without the English language, without family support, without a skill set. and without money, and so they had to take on any kind of work in order to survive and to feed my brother and I. So my parents ended up doing janitorial work, yard work. They worked in assembly line in factories, anything in order to survive. But I never remembered them pitying themselves. I mean, of course, they were still young. They were in their 30s when they came here, but I never remember a sense of self-pity or cursing their fortune and changing fortune. They were grateful to be alive. They were grateful to have their freedom because they knew what the alternative was, and that was life in Vietnam. And so maybe that's what kept them going, and also a future for us, for my brother and I, to have a better future someday, just like so many immigrant families who took that risk and left everything behind. Was just that hope for a better future. I know it sounds cliche-ish, and we hear it a lot, but I don't think it's because it's true and it is genuine. And yeah. And on top of that, another challenge that I can't imagine how they could have coped was dealing with all of that. And then within the first couple of years, my youngest sister was born. So I have two younger children came after my brother and I. There's a total of 4 of us kids. My middle sister, Tan, was born, and then my youngest sister, too, was born. And she was born with special needs. And to find out, as parents, that the youngest has special needs, and wondering how you would be able to provide for her, given your limited resources, it's pretty tough.
Yeah. You're in school, and early on things aren't going well for you. I think at one point you say your teachers thought you were ineducable. I think that's the verb you used. But then we fast forward, and now the Army's saying, we'll put you through college, we'll trade you a college education for 4 years for your service. When that letter came from the Army, for your parents, was that kind of the day when, they felt like maybe all of this had been worth it?
Oh, definitely. They were so proud and they were so happy, and I was very glad that I was able to do something to pay them, even though I don't feel like I ever could, for all of the sacrifices that they've made, in the hard life that they've had to endure. So yes, that was very very fulfilling for me, and for myself personally. And I say this in hopes, and I write this in hopes that a child in my situation, an immigrant, whether in Afghanistan or any parts of the world that come to this country at a young age, where English is not their first language, where they start off living in poverty, which is what we did, to say that your circumstances doesn't define who you are. And somehow I was lucky enough to understand that as a child. And I feel that maybe not all children may come to that realization. And I hope that they should, because I never let my circumstances define who I was. In fact, I used that as a motivator, because when I saw my parents struggle, I wanted so much to one day help them and give them a better life. And that's what motivated me to try. So I went from reading, writing, doing arithmetic below grade level throughout elementary school. Not because I was stupid, it was because I didn't have English as a first language. My parents were busy working, trying to feed us. We were moving all the time because my parents were looking for work. And so that was not probably the best setup for education. So I had some disadvantages, but I also had that determination. That's what I had going for me, was to say that, I can do better than this. And even though I can't get a job at a young age to help support my parents, the one job I had was to attend school, and I'm going to do it well. And so I was able to, by the time I went to high school, I was able to not only read at grade level, but I was in honors and advanced classes and graduated with honors in high school. And then in college, was able to attend college and graduated with honors in college, and went on to medical school and received a scholarship. Again, not to toot my own horn, but to say that to anyone, especially young people, I hope who get a chance to read this, say that you're going to encounter adversity in life, no matter what it is. But don't let that define you. You have to keep soldiering on, and keep going.
How long were you in the Army altogether?
I was for 4 years of Ready Reserve when I was on the scholarship, and 5 years of active duty. So I guess total 9 years.
Tell us about the work you're doing now.
I'm a medical director. I work with I supervise a group of physicians here. We work at a state center in Texas that care for adults with intellectual and developmental disability. Ranges from autism, cerebral palsy, traumatic brain injuries. So a whole gamut of special needs and level of severity. And it has been, again, I'm so lucky. I don't know how I've been so lucky in my career to have been able to serve. And this, I've thought about two very deserving populations that are on opposite ends of the spectrum. You have one, which is the military, where you think of, your cream of the crop, the young, the healthy. And then you have a very fragile population with very special needs. And to be able to serve both populations that are very special and inspirational to me has been very fulfilling. So I've been very fortunate in my career.
And this current work, was this a conscious decision of yours to move in this direction? Because you said that your younger sister, has special needs. So is there a direct connection between those two things?
She's definitely been an inspiration. Definitely. She lives at home with me, and I'm able to care for her. And I think that even though I work at a place to care for people with special needs, I think the best place for anyone with special needs, if they have the opportunity, is to be at home, where you have your family to be able to take care of you. But some people don't have that opportunity where when family members are aging, or there isn't the resource. There's not the resource. So they need places where I work at. And so my inspiration is that, God forbid, if for whatever reason, one day when I'm not able to take care of my sister, and she has to go to a place like this, I want to make it the best and the safest place possible for people with special needs to be able to reside in. I really want to express my gratitude to all veterans, especially the veterans, both the South Vietnamese and the Americans of the Vietnam era. They're the reason that have allowed Vietnamese Americans like myself to be able to share our story and to have experiences in the lives that we have today. I've learned so much from them, especially in writing this book. All the sacrifices that they've had to endure. And so I just wanted to express my gratitude to the veterans of that era.
When you see Vietnam veterans at the store with their Vietnam veteran hat on, will you sometimes talk with them?
Absolutely. I try to strike up conversations with veterans of any generation. And I really enjoy it. And I've always been met with just a lot of camaraderie and enthusiasm. Also, I mean, veterans of the previous generation inspired me to want to join the military.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything else that comes to mind?
General Yi.
Yeah.
Is remarkable as well. Wow, I mean, meeting him was the second half of wanting to write this book. So I hope people learn more about him if they get a chance to, if they, if they choose to pick up my book, to find out, what a remarkable and humble man this person was. And that's what made my dad want to reunite with him after close to 50 years. Was just how unique and how kind of a person as a commander that he was. And so.
Yeah. And there's a theme, because you write about him and of course the status he had with the Army of South Vietnam. But then here in the States, he has jobs that are pretty humble. I mean, I think at one point he's selling drinks and things like that at an amusement park, if I remember right.
So when I spent my time with him on this road trip with General Yi, I learned everything that he had gone through, and yet he was sitting in front of me. And he was so optimistic and so forgiving of everything that he'd gone through. And that really inspired me to say the world needs to know about this man. Here he was in prison at the prime of his life, in his mid 40s for 17 years, released when he was 62 at an age when people were thinking about retirement and having to start his life over in America. And when he was at the prime of his life, he was a 2-star general, commanded an army of over 10,000, or a division of over 10,000 soldiers. And my dad was just one of those soldiers in his division. He had personal helicopter pilots to deliver him to battlefields, and assistants and drivers. He had one of the best education in Vietnam. He was fluent in French and English, and had done military training with the U.S. troops in the 1950s and 60s. To all of that being taken away from him after 1975, his family, his children, his wife, his children separated from him for 17 years. Wow. And he was tortured and starved and beaten during that time, and had to come to the States and start his life all over again, bussing table at an Orlando restaurant. And then after that, working at an amusement park in Orlando, selling snacks and soda on a bicycle push cart to park visitors. And so when I thought about that, and I asked him this question, I said, were you ever bitter at your changing fortune? You had all of this and now your life has changed. And he just simply, smiled and said, for every phase of my life, God had a plan for me. When I was a general, I did my best to take care of my troops. And when I'm a busboy, I try to do my best doing the work that I had, because he said he was still strong, he felt productive, and he didn't want to depend on the charity of anyone else. He said that the core of who he was as a person didn't change, whether he was a general or a busboy. He felt no embarrassment or didn't feel ashamed of his change in status. And I mean, that left a huge impression on me. And whereas, I could imagine people feeling bitter or depressed at least, but that wasn't part of his character. And everyone that I spoke to when I interviewed for the book, whether it was American advisors that had known him during the war, his own children, they said that the person that you see in public is the same as in private. He has a consistent personality, which is very humble, very forgiving, compassionate, and optimistic. And so those are the qualities that my dad could easily see, even though he only had a handful of encounter with the general during the war.
Wow.
And that when I got, with my experience with him.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that about General Yi, and I hope that as time goes, of course, time is against us at this point, because we're talking about events that happened 50 years ago. I hope other members of the old South Vietnamese community in the United States, I hope that more of them will be willing to share their memories, just of what they remember, even if they were civilians, what they remember about old South Vietnam. I hope that more South Vietnamese military veterans will be willing to share their memories. once these stories are gone, they're gone. And so I just hope that more of them will be willing to share their memories so we can have them, as part of the record. What I tell vets and others is don't leave your stories to people like me, to history teachers, to create historical productions. Tell your story in your own way, in your own words, your own memories. So I hope that South Vietnamese who read your memoir or who hear what you say, I hope they'll be encouraged to share their own memories.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think more importantly, specifically the younger generation that are born here, they need to know how their families got here and what their grandfathers and their fathers experienced during the war that brought them here. I think they've lost that. My generation who came here as young children, we may still have an appreciation, understand, the whole journey. But for the later generation who were born here, they lose that. They lose that part of history. It becomes distant to them, and they don't feel a personal connection to it. So it's all the more important for the younger South Vietnamese generation, subsequent generations, to know why were they here, what brought them here. It wasn't just a history, something that happened in history that took place over 50 years ago. But it was actually their forefathers, and they need to understand that journey. So I think more specifically, I hope that the younger South Vietnamese, and I feel more passionate about this when I think about it, need to understand that journey.
I agree with you 100%. So I hope people will be encouraged to share their memories, share their stories. I really appreciate you writing yours and sharing the memories here in this discussion. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you.